Good morning, New Life Community Church, and happy Mother's Day. I want to take a moment to thank all the mothers in this room. Thank you, every single one of you, for carrying each of us for 9 months and for giving so much for so many years so that we could be here today. So if we could just start with a round of applause for all the moms in the room. Thank you. And now I also want to thank Fred for kicking off our new series last week, a series on the parables. We are covering for the next few weeks some of the parables of Jesus. Not all of them, because there are really too many for us to cover in one series, but we're getting a lot of the big ones. And we're going to start out simple. The difficulty is going to go up a little bit as the series progresses. The parables are going to get a little bit more complex, and you guys don't have to worry because we're going to break them down. But today is the parable of the sower, one many of you guys might have heard of. We're going to cover that first. Last week, Fred did a very fitting introduction talking about what the purpose of parables are and really why Jesus used them and how he used them to reach his audience. So to start off, before we actually get into the parable itself, I have a question. Does anyone here like riddles? Anyone? Riddles are sort of an old-fashioned thing. I feel like you don't really hear them as much anymore. But I've got a few for you guys today, and if you know the answer, shout it out loud. No need to raise your hand. I want to see how well you guys do. If you're still sort of waking up, hopefully we can get that thinking cap on and get the wheels spinning in the brain a little bit. So how about this one? See if you know it. Shout out the answer if you do. What has hands that cannot hold anything and has a face that cannot smile? Clock? Like I said, easy one. Now the difficulty is going to go up a little bit. Next one. What is more useful when it is broken? Ooh, an egg. Very good. Didn't even have to give a hint. And here's one more. What is full of holes but still holds water? Sponge, you guys are good. I didn't even have to give any hints. So hopefully that got you thinking a little bit. And that's what a good riddle does. It makes you think. It forces you to think abstractly and approach something from another angle. In the example of that first riddle, what has hands but can't actually hold anything and has a face but cannot smile, it's a clock. It forces you to sort of anthropomorphize, like humanize a clock and think of it in terms that you don't normally use to think of a clock. I like riddles. I'm not always very good at them. But there's a scene I love in one of the books in the Lord of the Rings series. It's the book called The Hobbit, where one of the characters, Bilbo, is stuck in a cave. He's lost in a series of tunnels, and he runs into this weird little creature named Gollum, who knows the way out of the tunnel. So they engage in a battle of wits. They challenge each other to a riddling contest, and whoever can solve the other's riddles will get what they want. So if Bilbo wins, if he can solve Gollum's riddles, then he'll be shown the way out of the cave. So riddles are really fun because they force you to think. But we don't always like doing that nowadays, do we? I feel like now in the 21st century, it's sort of easier for us to turn off our brains and stop thinking than it has ever been before. Have any of you guys ever heard of ChatGPT? Ever heard of it? For those unfamiliar, it's artificial intelligence, the most sophisticated artificial intelligence that we have access to currently. And it's an app that you can download on your phone. And because ChatGPT utilizes the combined knowledge of everything that's on the internet with sophisticated programming that allows it to almost think on its own, you can ask it a question and get the answer. You can ask it how to do something or how to solve something, and it will give you the answer. And it is way more sophisticated than Google. A buddy of mine that I was hanging out with in North Carolina this past week was showing me what ChatGPT is capable of. You can have a conversation with it. I bet you could ask it those riddles and it would actually know the answer. Crazy. So with resources like this, nowadays, we don't have to think. And sometimes we don't have time to think. You know, if you have a deadline at your job and you need to finish a project or produce results quickly, using artificial intelligence or technology can help you expedite your work. And sometimes you need to do that. People are now using artificial intelligence to get results at work much quicker than they could complete projects on their own. But it's not always a good thing when that creeps into our personal lives. And now we don't want to do any thinking. You know, I read an article in college called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And that was before all this AI stuff. And it was about how the ability to find information quickly on Google is making people lazy readers and lazy thinkers. We don't even need to figure something out on our own. We can just look up the answer. We don't need to research. We can just let the computer research. And I remember, and many of us laugh at this now, when I was in school back in the 90s and early 2000s, when teachers said, well, you're going to need to know how to do math because you're not going to have a calculator in your pocket all the time. Well, turns out we do. And who could have predicted that? And it's good to be able to compute quickly, but we're losing the ability to think. We're losing the ability to solve problems on our own. And we need to make sure that we do not lose that ability entirely. You know where our brains came from? God created them. God created our brain, and he wants us to use them. Even though we need to have faith and believe in God for things we can't understand, he still wants us to try to understand and to think. And you're going to see that that's really what parables force us to do. You'll have to listen to Fred's message from last week because he used an amazing quote by this guy named Robert Barclay, who was a Quaker, And he said that parables force us to think, to use our reasoning instead of spelling everything out for us. Jesus was the ultimate teacher. I don't care what anyone says. No one teaches better than Jesus. Jesus taught as one who not only knows people's hearts, but also as someone who knew the future. I believe that God, because he is God and he knows everything, knew that artificial intelligence was coming. He knows everything. He knew what humanity would eventually evolve and devolve into. He knew what the 21st century would look like. So Jesus knew when he was teaching, when he was preaching the Sermon on the Mount and giving his sermons before the Pharisees and before his followers and before all those people, he knew that he was preaching not just to them, but to future generations. That these lessons he was imparting would need to be able to speak for all time, and they do. And when Jesus was preaching about complicated things that were difficult for people to understand, a kingdom that we cannot see with our eyes, a new way of living that's really foreign to us and doesn't come naturally to us, he used things that people would easily understand, like money and farming and fishing. And that's what a lot of the parables are about. And today's parable is about farming. It's about sowing, which is a fancy word for putting seed in the ground. So let's get started with the verses. We're going to begin in Matthew 13, but this is one of those parables that you can actually read in the books of Mark and Luke as well, because there were multiple witnesses to all the things that Jesus said and did. You can read this story in more than one gospel. So let's start in Matthew chapter 13, verse 1. It says, that same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. If you want to know what else happened on that same day, you can read Matthew 12. Verse 2, such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables. And parables, as you're going to see, it is a word picture. It is sometimes a metaphor, sometimes a simile. A metaphor is just comparing something directly, just without any sort of preface, whereas a simile is saying like or as. Sometimes Jesus will say the kingdom of heaven is like, but here he doesn't introduce it that way. He just starts telling a story. So he begins this parable saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. Verse 4, as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Verse 7, other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Verse 8, still other seed, and here's the sweet spot, fell on good soil, where it produced a crop 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. That is something Jesus says a lot, which is sort of a way of saying, pay attention. Verse 10, the disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? And Fred addressed this last week. Fred actually quoted this part. And this is Jesus explaining sort of the purpose of parables. Why doesn't he just tell them what he meant by the seeds and the soil and the rocks and the thorns and all that? Why didn't he just say it plainly? I think one reason is it gets people's attention. When you start telling a story, people perk up, they listen. And now, sort of like a riddle, how when I gave you that riddle and the wheels started turning right away, you started trying to figure out what that means. I think that's why Jesus preaches in parables. Because instead of just saying, okay, yeah, kingdom of heaven, follow God, believe in him, do what's right, I get it. And instead of tuning him out, you're like, ooh, I'm not sure I understand this. And you start thinking. He doesn't spell it all out for them. And the disciples are curious about this. They're not too sure themselves. So they're like, well, why are you speaking in parables? Why don't you just say what you mean? So in verse 11, Jesus replies, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. That sounds kind of exclusive. Why is that? Let's read on verse 12. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Through seeing, or though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. How many know there's a difference between hearing and listening? Right? You ever hear someone's voice, resonating in your eardrums, but you tuned them out like 5 minutes ago, and you know they're still talking, but you have no clue what they're saying? You guys know what the adults sound like the teacher in Charlie Brown? You guys ever watch the Charlie Brown cartoons? And there's a teacher talking, it's like, womp, 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 womp. That's what it sounds like. You're hearing, you're not deaf, your eardrums are working, but you're not listening. You are not processing any information. And this is sort of what Jesus is talking about here. People who hear, but they're not really interested in listening. They're not really interested in understanding. Let's look now in verse 15, and this is where it becomes more clear. For this people's heart has become calloused. Have you guys ever had calluses on your hands before? Some of you were at the workday yesterday doing a lot of heavy lifting and moving of stuff. Sometimes when you're working in the yard, like moving bricks or something like that, you get these rough spots on your hands. This can happen too if you go to the gym and you do like powerlifting or a lot of deadlifting and benching. If you don't have gloves on, sometimes you get these rough spots on your hands. Now, calluses are good to protect your hands, but they're not good on your heart. If your heart becomes hard and rough and coarse like your hands, you might not be willing to receive something that goes into your heart. And this is what Jesus is talking about here, a callousness of the heart. Because their hearts are callous, he says in verse 15, they hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. That's important. Notice Jesus is saying, he's not saying I wouldn't heal them, even if they wanted me to. He's like, no, I would heal them if only they wouldn't be so hard. But they're not going to do that. Understand, Jesus is not speaking secretively because he doesn't want to tell them the truth. That's not the reason. He wants to tell them the whole truth. He just knows that they are not ready for it. Last week, I was talking with my sister-in-law about some documentaries she had seen on, I think, HBO Max and Amazon Prime about cults. You guys ever seen a little bit about cults? Crazy stuff that happens when people join this organization that just seems like a bunch of nice, happy people, and they don't find out until it's too late that they are actually getting sucked into a cult. Pretty creepy stuff. But these documentaries are interesting because you see patterns. You guys could probably quote like some of the more infamous cases of like cults that you've heard in history. That incident where the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid comes from, like suicide pacts, people who all died for some crazy belief that was manipulative and really false and not good. But when you look at cults, there are always patterns. And in talking with her and doing some of my own research, here are 2 signs that I found that you might be in a cult or that you might be looking at a cult. Number 1, this organization does not want you to think for yourself. That's one sign that you might be in a cult. Number 2, they don't want to tell you everything from the start. There's like fine print. There's like the secret information, information that they're not going to tell you until later. And by later, I mean when it's too late for you to like back out. They shut the door behind you, then they tell you that thing they hid from you at the beginning. I talked to some people even here recently who said they like went to a church, and they looked on the website. There was no sign that there was anything different about it from a normal church. But when they went to that church, at the end of the service, some people came up to them and started trying to convince them to become Mormons. Turns out it was a Mormon church. And there was no information about that on the website whatsoever. That is part of how you know you might be in a cult, either a sort of a less dangerous or a more dangerous cult. You know, whatever the level of danger or threat to you is, they all kind of have the same policy. You know, they don't want you to think for yourself, and then they don't tell you everything at once. Jesus is not like that. Jesus is not trying to start a cult. He wants to tell them everything from the start, but he knows that their hearts aren't ready to receive it. And this was ultimately not going to last for a very long time, because now the entire world does know what this parable means. Christianity is not a cult, guys. You don't have to worry about the Bible trying to trick you, because guess what? This entire thing is for free, and you can find the whole thing on the internet. You can pick it up almost anywhere. There's no secret knowledge or fine print in here that's going to sneak up on you later. You can read the entire thing, for yourself, and God wanted it to be that way. I guess maybe that was some secret knowledge, but that's something I put in there. 66 books, you can read them all completely by yourself. And no one's going to hide any knowledge from you. And if anyone claims that they know something that you don't or that the Bible doesn't know, they're not telling you the truth. They're trying to sell you something. So Jesus is not trying to start a cult here. He wants to tell everyone the whole truth all at once. But his audience is not very willing to receive this. His audience has a very hard time believing that anyone who's not Jewish has the blessing of God or can receive the favor of God or the salvation of God. They believe that if you're Jewish, if you're a descendant of Abraham, you're automatically called, you're automatically chosen. That all you need to do is keep being Jewish and follow all the rules, and that means that God's going to bless you. And that's not the message. Jesus is trying to prepare them for the idea that there is some rocky soil, that there are some bad hearts, there's some bad soil even within the nation of Israel. And that much to their shock, the Gentiles, non-Jewish people like us, can actually receive the salvation of God. And they are just as eligible as the Jewish people that are the descendants of Abraham. That is not a popular message back then. And many people are resistant to that and freaked out when Jesus said that Gentiles were going to receive God's salvation as well. For those of you who watch the series The Chosen, it does a very good job of showing that. How Jesus gets freaked out on and people criticize him and attack him when he starts healing other people that are not Jewish people and starts blessing them as well. So he's introducing information to them slowly, but he's not wanting to hold anything back or hide anything. He's trying to get people to think. Because they would flip out on him if he said, listen, like God is going to bring in Gentiles too. People would flip out. But if he explains it another way, if he's like, think about a fisherman who like draws in a bunch of fish and sorts them out later. Think about a sower who casts seed everywhere. Think about two brothers, one who does what the father wants and one who doesn't. He's starting to get them to think, to challenge the perspectives that they have grown up with and lived with all their lives, and forcing them to think differently. Guys, we need our perspectives challenged, because sometimes we are stuck in one way of thinking. And that one way of thinking isn't the only way, and it might not even be the right way. When our perspective gets challenged, we have a choice. We have the choice to either be humble and admit that maybe we were wrong and we didn't know everything, or the other alternative is to reject all the new information and only stick with what we know. The choice is yours. When someone challenges your perspective, what will you do? Will you consider another viewpoint, or will you stay stuck in your ways? And of course, we need to do that in light of God's truth, because only God can determine what is true and what is not. So now Jesus is going to explain what the parable means. So we can look at the next verses now. So we left off at verse 16, I think. So 17, actually. So Jesus says, it's actually in 15, but blessed are your eyes because they do see, and your ears because they do hear. So he's talking to his disciples. He's like, listen, I called you guys. I'm sharing this information with you because you guys do want to understand. This isn't a matter of intelligence. Please understand this. Jesus did not call his disciples because they were all intelligent, because they were remarkable people. If you read a little bit about them, you'll see that they were a little slow on the draw sometimes. He didn't choose them because they were brilliant geniuses. He chose them because they were willing to learn, because they were willing to listen. And that's all you need to be. You don't need to be a genius. You just need to be willing to learn and willing to listen. And that's what Jesus is saying. You guys are. And that's why I'm going to tell you what it means. He says in verse 17, "For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it." He's like, this is a big privilege. For thousands of years, people have waited to see the truth of God up close like this, and now it's your turn. Now you're getting to do it. And now he explains what the parable means. But before we get to the explanation, let's recap. You might think, oh, okay, what was that thing about the path and then the rocky place and thorns again? Like, before he explains the meaning, what was the outline again? So I simplified it for you guys. I have it right up here. So what was the first scenario that Jesus described? Seed that fell on a path. And what happened? Eaten by birds. How many of you guys have a garden in your backyard? And you might even have a bird feeder, and you see birds like come to the feeder, and sometimes a pesky squirrel gets in there and tries to eat the bird seed. So you might have seen this before, right? If you've ever put like seed on a path, it's not going to grow, because if you have like a slate path or a stone path or whatever it is, the seed can't grow. It can't grow into rock. So what's going to happen before anything can happen? Birds are going to come and eat that seed. It's on a path, it's easy to spot, so the seed is not going to grow. That's going to be what happens to it. And then the second scenario is seed that fell on rocky places. And what happens if you have some soil, right? Picture you have some rock, but there's some dirt on top of it, right? There's just a little bit of dirt that, got there somewhere, but it's not deep soil, it's shallow soil. And what happens there? Well, it says that the plant sprang up quickly, but it had no roots. How many people know deep roots are important? Foundations are important. If you don't have anything anchoring you down under the soil, you don't have enough support to survive. And because that soil was shallow, that's what happened to that seed. It sprang up quickly, and then it died. And then the third scenario, seed that fell on thorns. So what happened here? Well, the soil was deep enough. That wasn't the problem. The problem wasn't with the soil per se. It's that other plants were inhabiting it. Weeds that grew quickly and choked out other plants, and that's what happened to the seed. It was choked out by the thorns. And then you have the fourth scenario, which is the one we want to be in, which is the seed that fell on good soil. And what happens then? It produces a very large crop, an exponential crop. So what does it mean? You might have sort of an idea. Okay, there's seed that's being planted, and obviously when you cast seed, you want it to grow, right? Some of you might have seeded your lawns recently. You ever plant something and you're, watching the lawn or watching the garden, and every day, you're just peeking out there hoping it got a little bit bigger? That's why we plant seed, with the expectation that it will grow. So Jesus' audience is hearing this and being like, okay, good soil, good, thorns, bad, but what does this have to do with me? And that's a good question, because I believe that these parables are mirrors. In each of these parables that Jesus teaches, it's like a mirror. When you look in a mirror, you see your reflection, and you see what you look like. With these parables, I think we're supposed to look at them and see ourselves in them. As we look at the other ones, you'll ask, which brother am I? Which wedding guest am I? What kind of soil am I? And that's the question you should be asking. These parables hold up a mirror to us so we can see ourselves and see how we're doing and what we should be doing. So here's what the parable means now. Now that you've seen each type of seed and soil, let's see the meaning. So Jesus explains it in verse 18. He says, "Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, because they don't want to understand it." That's clear. Like I said, it's not a lack of intelligence. It's an unwillingness to learn and listen. So if anyone hears the message and doesn't want to understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. So the same way the birds, take away that seed before it had a chance to grow, that's what happens when someone is hard and doesn't want to let the message sink in. It stays on the surface, and then it gets snatched off the surface, and nothing ever happens. Verse 20, the seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word at once and receives it with joy, but since they have no root, they last only a short time. Ever see someone who's really excited to be a Christian? They're just fired up about being a Christian. They prayed the prayer, they accepted Jesus, and it just seems like they're so excited, but it doesn't last. It only lasts a little while because they had no roots. It was all superficial. It was all feeling. It wasn't commitment. So that is what is meant by the soil that is shallow on the rocky path that the seed doesn't grow roots into. And it says, when trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Trials test the genuineness of our faith. And it either makes or breaks us, really reveals what was already in us to begin with. And if those roots are shallow, that will be revealed if we go through trial and we cannot stand in it. Verse 22, the seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth chokes the word, making it unfruitful. And that happens. People do get choked out and distracted and discouraged from being Christians. And that is sort of like the thorns that will choke out a plant, even if the roots were growing in that soil. And then finally, this is what we want to be. Verse 23, but the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it because they want to understand it. Really want to make that clear. This is the one who produces a crop yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. And you might think, what kind of soil am I? I want to go back to that question. Which soil am I? It's natural to wonder that. Well, here's how you find out. I'm going to answer that question with another question. If you want to know which soil you are, consider this. How humble are you? How open to God are you? And how willing to admit that you are wrong are you willing to be? Are you willing to admit that you are wrong? Are you willing to be humble, to be open, and willing to admit that you are wrong? Because I believe that we can decide what kind of soil we want to be. Even though the way that people accept or reject God is mysterious and people have all sorts of theories about it, I think it comes down to this. The humble are the ones who are going to accept God, and the prideful are the ones who never will. It says in the word that God gives grace to the humble, but opposes the proud. That means pushes away. And you see consistently in the Bible and even in your own life, whenever someone is too prideful, too willing to admit they're wrong, too unwilling to admit that they need help, they don't want to admit any fault, they don't want to admit any need for other people, they're so stubborn, they will not accept God. And that's like that hard soil, that hardness that he was talking about. If soil is going to produce, you got to loosen it up. You ever do that when you're gardening? You turn over that soil. You loosen it. You rake it. You got to do that. But when someone's hard, nothing can get in. And that is the truth that Jesus is preparing people for. That you got to have a soft heart. You got to be open. It's okay to have a tough skin, but you got to have a soft heart. If you don't, you're going to push people away, and that includes God, because we were created for relationship with him and relationship with the people that he created. And you can't do that if you're hard on the outside and on the inside. Just nothing can get in. So I think we do have a choice in which soil we are. Some people will say you don't. I say you do. From everything I see in Scripture, God gives everyone a chance. Notice the sower casts that seed everywhere. He's casting it everywhere. Everyone gets a chance. Everyone gets a choice. So the question is, which soil are you going to be? Are you going to be hard? Are you going to be soft? Are you going to be closed? Are you going to be open? Are you going to think that you know all the answers? Or are you going to consider that maybe for the first time there's something you've been missing and there's someone who knows a lot more than you do? What's it going to be? The choice is yours. Jesus, thank you so much for being the ultimate gardener, for pruning us and preparing us and caring for us, so that if we are willing to learn and listen and work with you, there is nothing that can choke us out. That if we are willing to be soft and dedicated to you, you will clear everything else out from around us and make sure that we can grow. And even though there are going to be some storms, there are going to be some trials, there are going to be some things that beat down on us and test us, you're going to make sure that those roots and that soil is going to keep us growing ever and ever closer to you, closer to the Son that gives us life. Lord, thank you for your mercy. Thank you for connecting with us. Thank you for teaching us in a way that forces us to think. Thank you for helping us to use the brains that you gave us and encouraging us to ask questions, not hiding things from us, not telling us to turn off our critical thinking, but instead encouraging us and loving us even when we don't get it. Thank you for everything you do for us. We love you and praise you and pray all of these things in your name. Amen.